Okay, so much of today is talking about the rise of the dominant parties. We outlined it last time, the warring ideologies, the basic ideas that the parties will come to represent, but the two parties really solidify, the Federalist and Republican parties of the 1790s. They very much solidify during the first administration, and especially going to the election of 1796. And outside of all the financial stuff we talked about last time, the national debt, the creation of a Bank of the United States, treaties with Britain and whatnot, that stuff is all ongoing in the early 1790s. Hamilton is pushing for all that, and he largely gets almost everything he wants by the end of Washington's first term in office. Another problem for the United States that rises immediately when the new constitutional government is formed and sits and starts actually governing 1789 is the rise of the French Revolution. So I'll do some background with the French Revolution, just give a general definition of what it was about, how it started, and then we'll talk about the United States' relationship with the revolutionary governments. And there'll be more than one, there's several. So this is another big kind of source of political debate, a foreign policy debate in the United States. In the 1790s will largely revolve around what should the United States stance be on the French Revolution. Should it be supportive? Should it be anti-revolution? Should it be somewhere in between? And the rising parties seize on that question and solidify themselves largely around it going forward. Okay, French Revolution starts semi-officially in about May of 1789. Background to the revolution: the French monarchy was broke. Had a huge national debt going all the way back to at least the 1750s. That was a giant problem for its national economy. The French monarchy was in bad financial circumstances by the 1750s. Was made worse by fighting the 7 Years' War that they eventually lost by 1763. So the French monarchy was largely bankrupted, even though they won't declare bankruptcy. They're put in a very bad financial place by the war. And the French monarchy is absolutely humiliated by it. So the British have risen. This is 1763. This is where the British take over Canada, the American colonies all the way to the Mississippi and whatnot. So the French monarchy is humiliated. They're angry, and they're looking for any good opportunity to get back at the British on the worldwide stage, the worldwide scale. So when the American Revolution breaks out, 1775, actual fighting starts. The French start debating whether or not to support the American Revolution in order to hurt the British. We've already talked about that in here, right? Okay. There are great debates within France about whether or not the French should support the American Revolution. Most of the French want to support the American Revolution because they hate the British and they want to do anything they can to hurt the British Empire. A lot of economists, or economists at the time, and a lot of financial advisors to the French king say, we would love to do it, but we can't afford it. You are too far in debt already. If you go in and start borrowing money to support a revolution in a different part of the world just because you hate the British, that is going to destroy your finances to the point where you may have to declare bankruptcy. And of course, just like if people declare bankruptcy today, your credit score goes into the toilet, people start jacking up interest rates on you if you need to borrow money in the future. It's a real bad thing, especially for governments. The French king eventually overrules his financial advisors. The French government supports the American Revolution, go into greater debt. The Americans eventually win the war with French help, a certain extent of French help. By 1783, so the Americans are happy, they have their own country, they're going to have to start dealing with their own financial problems. And the French monarchy is financially destroyed by it. the French king goes through and picks out one supposed economic expert after another through the rest of the 1780s. These are basically called financial ministers, ministers of the treasury basically. Appoints one after another to solve the government debt problem. And he goes through about 6 of them within about 8 years or so. 7 or 8 years. And one after another went to the king and said, your major problem is that the rich are not paying taxes. The rich landowners of France, in this feudal economy with peasant serfs and everything, the landowners are avoiding taxation to the point where the government's not getting enough revenue to continue functioning on a daily basis. So what the government has done over the past 40 years or so is to borrow money. And year after year of doing that for several decades has now come to a head. And the financial ministers advised the king, this is the day of reckoning. This is when you have to make a decision. And the French king doesn't like that advice because the landowners are the wealthy and the powerful, so he has to keep them kind of on his good, or he has to stay on their good side, so he doesn't really want to raise their taxes. He calls a meeting of the wealthy French people in 1787 that's called the Assembly of Notables. And the king shows up to the meeting and basically turns the meeting over to his financial minister of that year. And the guy literally reads a speech to the French landowners saying, if you don't willingly agree to start paying taxes, stop avoiding taxes and start paying, then the French government is going to declare bankruptcy. And that's going to be a huge catastrophe for all of France. And what do the French landowners say? Are they willing to pay their taxes? They say, no, screw you, we ain't paying no taxes. Come up with a better idea. So that that finance minister resigns. They bring in the next guy. How are you going to solve the problem? He comes up with the exact same solution. You have to raise taxes on the rich somehow. The rich are not allowing it. So there's a major standoff. The French king, basically the average people, the peasants, are already paying as much in taxes as they possibly can. They're barely keeping their head above water. So the French king, in order to raise taxes just by his own decree, announces the meeting of the Estates General. This is an ancient body that hadn't been called in something like 180 years. But there is French tradition that if the king calls this meeting, where the representatives of the people will show up to this massive gathering at Versailles, the king's official residence, that they can give him permission to raise taxes in really almost any way he sees fit. So this Estates General will be broken up between 3 different groups. Number 1, members of the French clergy, basically the Catholic Church, so they'll get some membership in this meeting. Number 2, the nobles, the landowners, get a certain section. They're called the Second Estate. And number 3, the mass population will be able to elect their own representatives to go to the meeting. And the so-called Third Estate, the representatives that win these elections of the people, they will make up about half the people present at the meeting. So right off the bat, the king has to decide, who do you listen to? Do you listen to the nobles, the clergy, or the people's chosen representatives? This turns bad for the king, because the representatives of the people are upset that they're basically being cut out of the negotiations. They announce that they are going to form a national lawmaking body. And they declare themselves to be the national lawmaking power of France. They try to take that power from the king. And that kicks off the French Revolution. There are a lot of fears that the king is going to go off and arrest the leaders who have made this declaration. Right? These are people that are claiming power. There are a lot of fears around France, around Paris in particular, that the king is starting to mobilize his armies within France to arrest these revolutionary leaders, throw them in jail, and possibly just execute them all. Fear and paranoia boils over. This is going into June and July of 1789. By mid-July, the king's troops are starting to move around in Paris, and there's mass fear of some kind of king's move to cut off the head of these basically popular complaint leaders.
What was the three groups in that meeting? The clergy?
The clergy, the nobles, and the kind of elected representatives of the people. But there's a lot of fear and paranoia going around that the king is going to start mass arrests of anyone who has been complaining about the government. And riots break out in Paris. One riot in particular on July 14th goes after a government building in Paris called the Bastille. The Bastille is the government building, the fortress in Paris where the king has sent political prisoners for hundreds of years by this point. This is the big symbolic place. This is like the Guantanamo Bay of France, where the monarchy has been sending its political opponents, basically throwing them in a hole, sometimes for the rest of their lives. I mean, there's torture, there's executions. This is where the monarchy gets rid of its enemies. So this is a famous prison in France that really not many people are even allowed to talk about very much. And the fear of a crackdown appears to have inspired a lot of people to at first gather outside the Bastille and then attack it. They invade the Bastille. They murder some of the government guards of what is basically a prison complex. And they free a whole bunch of the political prisoners, saying that this is an evil thing the monarchy has done. That all people in France should have rights under the law. And that's something that the French Revolution will start talking about. But they not only invade the thing and set some of the prisoners free and kill a bunch of the guards, they also tear the whole thing down. And if you look at the size of people compared to the size of the building, and realize they tore this thing down in about 2 days, without bulldozers, without cranes, without wrecking balls. They tore this thing down with their bare hands. And that shows you the anger that the French people had come to feel for their government. They feel that the government is repressive, it is a dictatorship, it is not functioning in the interest of the French people. The French people are paying taxes, the rich are not. So the people start taking control. They go to Versailles, where the king lives and is supposedly holding these meetings with this revolutionary group. They attack the king's residence. They kill some of his personal bodyguard. They take him back to Paris as basically a prisoner. So the king is brought back to Paris. I think this is about October or so of 1789. And they're going to start negotiating to write a French constitution, an actual government document. They seem to have been inspired by the American Constitution. Remember, this is only a year after the American Constitution was written, or 2 years. The American Constitution was written in the summer of 87. This is happening in the summer of 89. France had never had a constitution before. Never had a written document. They were like Britain. They functioned basically off of tradition, common law. So writing an actual document that would give certain levels of government certain powers and say that government can't take away certain rights of the people, this is a big deal to the French people. And it appears to be very reminiscent of the American Revolution. So what do you think the Americans thought of all this going on? Any idea? No guesses even? Do the Americans not like this? Do they support it? What do you think?
Supported it.
They absolutely support it. They love it. Remember, the American population tended to believe, and even the American leadership, like Washington, tended to believe that the American Revolution was only the first. In a wave of revolutions, they wanted to sweep the world and get rid of kings, particularly in Europe. So when the French Revolution hits, in the first year that the constitutional government sits under President Washington and Congress, this is all happening in the same months, where the Americans are writing a Bill of Rights. This is all literally the exact same timeline. So the American population is wild with support for this stuff. Especially because this is happening in one of the most ancient and one of the most powerful governments in all of Europe. This is one of the big empires. So the Americans very much believe that this is the next step in the worldwide revolution against kings, to establish democracy throughout the world. So this is time for great optimism, especially in the United States, because the Americans just watching this stuff don't have to deal with the violence. There's a whole lot of massacres also that go on. There's a lot of just rampant murder going on in France at the same time. So the Americans largely take the kind of idealistic view of this. They're creating democracy and equality and all that. And for a while they turn a blind eye to a lot of the violence and a lot of the kind of massacres of innocent people that are also going to go on in France for a while. The Americans largely changed their mind when the French eventually declared war against basically the rest of Europe in the spring of 1792. But a lot of Americans say, look, the rest of Europe, our kings, are going to conspire to kill off this revolution in France. So some Americans don't mind that France is going to war with the rest of Europe at basically the same time. At the same time, in the summer of 92, the French people basically rise up and start a riot outside the place where the king was being imprisoned. And they depose the monarchy. They officially get rid of monarchy in France in, I believe it's August or September of 92. So they're skipping ahead pretty quickly. They've written the Constitution. The king approved it, but people said he basically stabbed him in the back, which he appears to have done. But they arrest the king, they get rid of the monarchy, and they put the king on trial for treason against his own people. They find him guilty, and just a few weeks later execute him in January of 1793. And when news of this reaches the United States, this is where a lot of Americans start to heavily doubt the French Revolution. They start to believe it's getting too violent, it's getting out of hand, and a lot of Americans start to turn their back on the French revolutionary leaders. The French Revolution gets extremely violent. Tens of thousands of people are killed in it, if not hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, we don't have accurate numbers. But massacres sweep France in at least 3 different instances, where there's just fighting out in the countryside and people are killing each other in the streets. So the French government is basically destroyed by this. And they set up a new government where they start basically policing themselves. Anyone who speaks out against what the government is doing, it can be executed just for complaining. So the French Revolution gets extremely bloody. And from witnesses we have in Paris, they say that there's so many executions in Paris itself, the big city, that the streets literally were stained red with blood. They didn't have enough time to wash it off before the next execution. So this is extraordinarily inhumane and extraordinarily violent. And in comparison, the American Revolution was fairly peaceful, right? The Americans, when they create democracy, when they create voting rights, they don't start cutting each other's heads off. They just go to elections. They hold elections. Whoever wins goes into office. Whoever loses goes home. But the American Revolution is a very different revolution from most other places in the world historically. Most revolutions are pretty violent. The American Revolution, the Americans don't slaughter each other for the most part. So Americans tend to have a different idea of what revolution has become historically just because of the American experience. Okay, so U.S. popular opinion starts to turn again against the French Revolution because it's becoming so extraordinarily violent. And the stories coming in from France are just horrific. They're bloody beyond any kind of description that anything the Americans were willing to deal with. And revolutionary France has declared war against the major powers of Europe. Basically, the French leaders were afraid that these countries were going to conspire to invade France and kill off the revolution, try to put the French royal family back on the throne. So they, over time, developed this kind of theory that the only way the revolution could survive in Europe was to declare war against these countries and hit them first, possibly conquer some of these countries, and inspire revolutions to begin in these countries like Prussia, Austria, Britain, with the theory that the only way revolution in France could survive is if revolution starts in those other countries, knock those kings off their thrones, and establish democracy basically in all the kind of powerful countries in the world. Then the French would have nothing to fear from other countries. Does that make sense? So it's a convoluted theory, and as the revolution gets more extreme, and you could be executed for disagreeing with the theory, it tended to kind of snowball and grow and grow and grow. So revolutionary France, from about 1792 forward, will basically be at war with the rest of Europe, give or take. Countries drop in and out of the war, but basically they'll usually be fighting some combination of Austria, Prussia, and Britain for about the next decade or so. And that causes a big source of debate in the United States. American population has turned against the French Revolution for being too violent. But what about government policy? What's the official government stance in the United States about the French Revolution? At first was outright support. Revolutionary brothers in France and other countries should rise up, get rid of their kings. But once they declare war on basically the rest of the continent, now the U.S. leaders have a big decision to make. Do you continue to support France internationally and possibly be dragged into a war against the rest of the continent? Do you support Britain or Prussia or Austria in trying to resist the French Revolution? Or you just stay out of it? Does anyone want to take a guess at what the eventual decision is? Stay out of it. Because the United States is a weak country at this point. Has a tiny army. Somewhere around 5,000 troops, if that. The French revolutionary armies are going to number the hundreds of thousands. So the United States does not have the military power to influence these events. And virtually every American leader knows it. The American army is barely big enough to even to defend the American coastline. And number two, if you continue supporting France, you make big-time enemies. Britain, Prussia, Austria, these are the dominant military powers of the world at this point. And the United States just finished barely winning a war against Britain. And the United States is in a bad place financially in 1789, 1792, right? I mean, the United States economy is still tied to Europe because they were a colony, and largely tied to Britain. So the argument arises, not only is it good militarily to stay out of this war because we don't have a big enough army to even defend ourselves if we're attacked, but economically it's probably a good idea because we don't want to make an enemy out of Britain. And also, if you stay out of the war, and many American businessmen knew this, you can sell supplies to every country fighting, right? If you sign an alliance with France, then you can only sell stuff to France, right? You can't sell stuff to your enemies. That would be unpopular, be considered unpatriotic or something. So a lot of American businessmen, who of course have a lot of pull in the government because they're fairly wealthy, say we want to keep neutrality because with neutrality we can sell stuff to the French, we can sell stuff to the British, the Austrians, the Prussians, anyone who's fighting, anyone who's not fighting. We can sell our goods, American-made goods, to everybody. And this helps the American economy boom. The fact that these governments, starting in 1792, are going to buy up as many guns, boots, as much food, cloth, sails, anything that they can possibly get their hands on. So the American economy just goes into an absolute boom period because of the European-wide war. American businesses are selling stuff all over the continent, and they're pretty happy to do it. They're making huge amounts of money. So this is another piece of the so-called financial miracle that Hamilton built up. So questions about any of this stuff going forward? Yeah?
Why did they decide to buy from the U.S. instead of buying from their own country or making their own weapons?
Because these countries are at war, especially France. France does not have a professional army at this point. They've gotten rid of the king's armies, right? So the French government calls upon the French farmers, the average people, to go get guns and go out into the countryside and defend the nation. So it's a kind of draft of the average French workers. And when you do that, you lose a lot of workers. You have to replace that somehow. And governments in general buy as many supplies as they possibly can when they're at war. And that's we can prove that historically right up to this very moment. But revolutionary France, in a lot of ways, especially with that kind of draft and that message to the average people. I mean, it's the same thing the Americans did, right? American people have to rise up and defend their rights. And that's largely the argument circulating around France. Other questions? All right. But this idea of whether or not to support the French Revolution, what kind of foreign policy stance to take, either support for France, support for Britain, or neutrality in general. Also, when it's getting voted in Congress, when these debates are happening in Congress, it starts coming down to the rising parties. So Madison is one of the leaders. He is the leader of the rising Republican Party. He gets the people who tend to agree with him to not like neutrality very much. The Republican Party, because largely it's led by Jefferson and Madison, they believe in revolution. Jefferson especially vocally, publicly supported the French Revolution right at its outbreak. So the Republican leaders are very pro-French. And they are also anti-British because of their own backgrounds, right? And if Jefferson and Madison, they hate the British. We've already talked about that to a pretty large extent. So the Republicans under Jefferson and Madison are largely pro-French thinkers. They are pro-revolution. They are anti-monarchy. So they support the French Revolution from its very outset, and they're very unwilling to criticize the French Revolution, even when the revolution gets very bloody against its own population. They'll get quiet about it, but they won't often come out and say the revolution has turned kind of evil for its own people, or destructive of its own people. So the Republicans don't like neutrality because they want to actively support France in these wars. The Federalists, led by Hamilton, want to keep neutrality because Hamilton is more of an economic thinker. He says the United States is not powerful enough to fight in these wars, and staying neutral will give us an economic boom. Remember, about 75% of the U.S. economy is still tied to British trade because it was a British colony formerly. So Hamilton's argument is the revolution's getting out of hand, so it'd be dangerous to support it. And it's also dangerous because if we support France, then we anger the British, and the British still have the power to sink the American economy. So he wants to do everything possible to not upset Britain, because he wants to build up American economic power. As he calls it, economic independence leads to real political independence. So Hamilton at least wants neutrality. And these arguments, these different pieces of advice are given to President Washington, and he has to figure out what to do. His choice is pretty clear. He formally declares neutrality. And neutrality seemed to have a very large amount of support in the American population. That seemed to be the safest way to go, seemed to be the kind of most steady and stable course of decision making. Let the Europeans destroy themselves. We don't want any part of it. So questions about this one at all? Okay, so in the first major kind of foreign policy debate, you see that this is largely falling down along the rising party lines. Washington has another problem. the British are going to war. 1792. And when Britain goes to war, they're overwhelmingly a naval power because they're an island. That's their long-term kind of military defense tactic. So when Britain goes to war, they're going to launch a bunch of boats out into the oceans to, number one, defend the British islands and attack their enemies. They need a lot of sailors, especially, not just soldiers, land soldiers, but they usually need a whole lot of sailors. So one thing that Britain starts doing pretty frequently when they go to war, they start passing impressment laws, which are basically a British draft. So British government officials in the British Navy will go into ports throughout the world and find British sailors on private boats, private employees of some British company that's just sailing around buying and selling stuff. They will find those guys and often accuse those guys of being deserters from the British Navy. And they have the power to arrest British citizens and force them into the British Navy to get more sailors. This whole thing is called impressment, where the British are impressing their own citizens into the British Navy for as long as the war takes to be decided. One of the major problems with this worldwide policy is that the United States used to be a British colony. So a lot of Americans have British kind of ancestral ties. They still speak with a British accent in a lot of instances. So it's very popular. So if you're a British citizen, a sailor somewhere in the world, and the British Navy people come to you and say, are you a British citizen? And you of course say, no, I'm an American. You might be able to get away with it, right, to avoid the draft. Problem with that is a lot of American citizens said that they were Americans too. And if they didn't have a passport or some kind of documentation proving that they're a citizen of the United States, then they can be swept up in this net and forced into the British Navy. Does that make sense? American citizens didn't like that very much. So impressment in the United States is very unpopular because it's sweeping up a lot of American sailors. And of course, these are the husbands and brothers and nephews and all that kind of stuff of the American population. So impressment is an outrage to the American people. So Washington has declared neutrality, but he also has to start trying to make a deal with the British to stop doing this to American citizens, because this is basically a crime against the American population. He sends John Jay to Britain to negotiate a treaty. But John Jay experiences the same problem he had when he went to Spain to negotiate the treaty with them over the Mississippi. And that problem is the United States does not have enough power to force the British to do anything. So through the treaty negotiations, Jay is able to get the British to finally remove their troops from the northwestern forts, remember, out in the Ohio areas. So the British are finally willing to do that because they have to move troops around to fight this war in Europe, so they don't see it as a big deal. The one thing they will not give in on, though, is the right of impressment. Jay tries to get the British to at least develop better systems for identifying American sailors, and when they're impressed, to release them, get them out of the British Navy and send them back home. But those systems don't seem to be very reliable, and the British just don't give in. So Jay eventually signs a treaty, as weak as it is, sends it back to, I think at this point the government's sitting in Philadelphia, but sends it back to President Washington. And Washington has to decide whether or not he supports this thing. Washington reads the treaty and reads Jay's notes on the treaty. He sends back letters saying, this is how the negotiations went day by day. And Washington realizes that this is a humiliating treaty. So Washington is very much torn on whether or not he should support this thing. Washington signs the treaty, sends it to the Senate. The Senate has to get 2/3 to ratify the treaty. So he sends it to the Senate, just a treaty. He wants to keep the notes secret because Jay's notes on this thing, on the negotiations, are humiliating. The treaty is humiliating enough. The American population hates it, views it as a slap in the face. They demand the negotiation notes. They want those notes published. Washington says no. Privately, he says, because these things are so humiliating that the American people might rise up against their own government. So Washington cites something called executive privilege, which basically means these negotiations have to be kept secret. Because if John Jay knew that everything he was saying to the British was going to be published in American newspapers, then he won't say what needs to be said, right? Because Jay's a politician himself. Washington argues that the negotiations have to be kept secret because the president has to get the best advice possible from all sources. And if those sources know their advice is going to be published in the American media, then they won't tell the president everything the president needs to know. Does that make sense? Because those advisors want to be popular too if they're going to run for office in the future. So Washington tries to keep these notes secret by citing executive privilege. And this is something that has grown. It is used on a daily basis today. The president's advisors still cite this. The president does not want to release internal discussions within the administration. And this idea of executive privilege, the exact same argument is being made today on a daily basis. Not just with foreign treaties, but even internal stuff, domestic policy. So the American population is also outraged that Washington won't publish the notes on the thing. It takes a couple of years to get this treaty ratified in the Senate, and it only gets ratified when Washington goes and testifies before the Senate and says, this is the best we're going to get. So he throws his immense prestige behind the treaty, eventually gets it passed. So a treaty is ratified. The United States has a treaty with Britain. The British will try to avoid impressing reconciliation as much as possible, but there's no real guarantee. And this leads to the next major problem. Remember, this treaty is ratified in 1796. The new French government, called the Directory, that's the executive kind of branch of the French government at this point. The Directory is a calm, conservative kind of government. They stop the executions. They stop all that. So they're much more cautious. The new leaders of the French government hate the United States for signing a treaty with Britain. Why? Because France is still at war with Britain. And the French start complaining, saying, we helped you during your revolution. Now you're stabbing us in the back. Why don't you support our movement for revolution against European kings? So the French criticism of the Jay Treaty between the United States and Britain is heavy, it's public, it's international. And it's happening during an American election year, 1796. Washington refuses to run for a third term of office. He was elected in 88, 92, and he could have gone for a third term in 96, but he chose to go into retirement. Would he have been reelected? Who knows? Because he was unpopular to a lot of Americans going into this election. So instead of having his name dragged through the mud, he decided to retire, go back home, and he said he wants to just live out the rest of his years in peace and tranquility. So it's a presidential election year. His vice president, John Adams, runs for the Federalist kind of party's leadership. Jefferson runs for president amongst the Republicans, and it's a very close election between Adams and Jefferson in 1796. Adams wins by 3 electoral votes. So it's a very, very, very close election. So you will get President Adams going into March of 1797. Back then, presidents were not inaugurated until March. So John Adams is the president-elect in the end of 96, going into early 97. And, this is when the French are criticizing the American treaty with the British. The French are calling for some kind of, they start calling for the Americans are basically an enemy of France now. I mean, the French are considering going to war against the United States over this. So the incoming President Adams decides to follow the exact same policy that Washington did with Britain. When there's a kind of small-scale threat of war with Britain over impressment, Adams says, we're going to send some negotiators to Paris to talk to the French government leaders, and we'll try to get a treaty to avoid war. Over the first few months, as he goes into the presidency, Adams has problems appointing ambassadors. He first wants to appoint James Madison, because Madison is a pro-French person, leader of the Republican Party. That seems to be kind of the best person in the best position to go to France and negotiate. Madison refuses. So Adams will have to appoint some other ambassadors and send them to Paris. He eventually appoints 3 ambassadors, 3 American ambassadors. They go to Paris to negotiate directly with the leaders of the French government. The French foreign policy leader is a guy named Talleyrand at this point. Talleyrand appears to be a fairly corrupt politician in France. He sets up the 3 American ambassadors in a hotel in Paris and drags his feet in starting the negotiations. So these American ambassadors are sitting in their hotel rooms waiting to start talking to the French government. Then one night, 3 French guys show up. They won't even give their real names. They give code names. They call themselves X, Y, and Z. And they tell the American ambassadors that before the French government is even going to open negotiations, the American government has to pay a $250,000 bribe to Talleyrand himself personally, and has to give a $12 million loan to the French government. That's their demand. They say, once you do those 2 things, we'll open negotiations on a treaty. The ambassadors are pissed. They send letters back to Adams. This is what's going on. This is why the negotiations are not starting. And Adams is pissed off. He recalls the ambassadors. 2 of them come back. 1 of them stays behind just in case they decide to open negotiations. So Adams, without any public statement, recalls the ambassadors and goes to Congress and starts asking Congress for money to build up the American Navy. And Congress and the American public, who don't know what happened in Paris about the bribe and everything, that's all kept secret, they start saying, what the hell? You wanted negotiators, you sent them to Paris, now you're going to Congress basically asking for money to prepare for war. What happened? And Adams doesn't want to say what happened. He cites executive privilege again, right? He doesn't want these negotiations or lack of negotiations going public, because this is, again, a slap in the face of the American population, could start riots and whatnot throughout the country. So there's a real possibility of war between the United States and France at this point, in the spring and summer of 1797. And again, the possibility of war starts breaking down along party lines. Adams and the Federalists start talking about possibly signing an alliance with Britain. A military economic alliance with Britain, which would be obviously anti-French because Britain is fighting against France. So the Federalists tend to like that because the Federalists have really given up on the French Revolution. They say it's too bloody, it's too corrupt, it is not the good revolution of equality that they started off with. So the Federalists, largely led by Hamilton, want to start negotiating with Britain and dump France as a possible ally. The Republicans are publicly angry at that. The Republicans hate Britain. They view Britain as the source of all corruption and evil in the world. Jefferson's old idea, the banking systems, all the national debt and all that kind of stuff. And the Republicans want to stay anti-British and also stay pro-French, because France is fighting wars against the rest of Europe, and a lot of Republican leaders say, let's support France in those wars in Europe. Maybe they'll be able to set up democratic governments in other parts of Europe that they conquer. So again, the negotiations with France at this point are now breaking down according to which party you really belong to. So these parties are solidifying under the threat of war. First, war against Britain under President Washington, now possible war against France under Adams. So these are the debates that are raging in newspapers and communities throughout the country. And there's also, these debates are raging within the U.S. Congress itself. And for the next couple years, it's going to be a very close thing whether or not the United States and France actually go to war with each other. The French government starts giving permission for French pirates to basically attack American shipping all throughout the Atlantic, and then the Americans respond saying Americans could basically do the same thing. So there's a small-scale kind of privateer war, actual fighting between American and French boats, but not officially between the governments. So does this make sense? Questions about any of this? And one of the major problems is that these two parties are so rigidly ideological in whether or not to support Britain or France or whoever, that as circumstances change in France and in Europe, these parties are unwilling to kind of rationally realign their priorities. They're sticking to their same old ideas from the 1780s, even though the politics in Europe, France, Britain have changed in the 1790s. That's always a problem with political parties. When their ideologies become so rigid that they cannot adapt to new circumstances, then you can have big, big problems. There are popular calls throughout the United States for Adams to publish the negotiators' notes from Paris to find out what the hell happened. Why did these negotiations break down? The American people want to know. They have inquiring minds. Adams does not want to publish that stuff. Because remember, he's got one guy still in Paris, and Adams publicly says, I don't want to publish this stuff because the French could get so angry that we publish it that they might arrest our American ambassador to France. Bad things might happen to that guy. So that's his public statement. Congress starts voting to force the President of the United States to publish those negotiations. And they win. Adams eventually gives in. And when those things are published, Adams is a pretty unpopular guy at this point. He seems to be kind of untrustworthy. He wants one thing, then he changes his mind. He doesn't tell the American people why he changes his mind. But when these things are published, Adams' popularity skyrockets. The American people come to understand why he stopped the negotiations and took an anti-French stance and started asking for money to build up the American Navy in case of war. The American people largely look at Adams as a strong defender of national honor and national strength. And as his popularity skyrockets, a lot of pressure is put on Congress to give in to what Adams asked for, specifically in building up the American military to fight. So Congress, in the summer of '98 now, this, of course, is taking a while. In the spring, summer of '98, Congress and the American population are at a fever pitch. They feel that war with France is imminent. They start giving Adams more money than he ever even dreamed of, than he ever asked for. Having an army, an American army of 5,000 troops in the 1780s and early 90s was very controversial. They give Adams the power to create an army of 50,000. They give him huge amounts of money to build up the American Navy. So they are giving Adams not only what he asked for, but far beyond anything he ever asked for. And they go a little bit far in passing new laws that become known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. So June and July of 1798, they passed these 3 laws that become very controversial in the United States. Okay, the first law is called the Alien Enemies Act, which says literally the President of the United States, during a war against another country, can declare any person from that country as a potential enemy of the United States. So if you go to war against France, if the United States declares war against France, then any French people living in the United States can be arrested or removed from the United States, kicked out of the U.S., just simply for being French. So there's a fear of like French internal spies within the United States that are going to try to do something to the American government. So it's called the Alien Enemies Act. And again, it's only supposed to take effect when the United States officially goes to war against another country. So that's one step that's pretty disgusting, right? I mean, individual people may not even agree with their home government, where they're from, about what their government's doing. But this is a law passed by Congress. The next law is even worse. The Alien Act gives the President of the United States the power during war or peace. So he doesn't even need a declaration of war to start doing this, to expel any non-naturalized person of foreign birth. Which means he doesn't need a war, and it can be any foreigner from any country that the President judges to be dangerous to the peace and safety of the U.S. So whatever that means. That's pretty vague. So now the President has the power to kick out any foreigner at any time, basically. And this is not with any court hearings or anything. It's basically Army coming and arresting people and either putting them in jail or kicking them out of the country. And you can imagine a lot of people complained about these laws. These are grossly unconstitutional laws. Right? You're supposed to have the freedom to trial by jury and all that kind of stuff. That's not just for American citizens. That's for anybody living in the country. It doesn't say the rights of the citizens. It says the rights of the people. So there's a lot of complaint about these things being unconstitutional. The Federalists have the majorities in Congress. So the Federalist Party is larger than the ones pushing this. President Adams signs these things for some reason or another. And since there is so much complaint, they pass a third law called the Sedition Act, which makes it illegal to say or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government of the United States. So if you're walking around in the streets and you make an accusation about what the U.S. government is doing, that you don't like it, you can be arrested for that. If you publish a newspaper article that criticizes the U.S. government, you can be arrested for that. So this is an even grosser level. Anybody in the United States can be a target of arrest just for speaking out against what the government's doing. And this is obviously against free speech, freedom of the press, all kinds of different parts of the Constitution. This is pretty gross stuff. Most of these laws are never actually used. The United States never declares war against France formally, so the Alien Enemies Act is never used. The Alien Act had a limit. It said it would only be enforced until 1801, after the next presidential election. And Adams appears to have never used this one. But he did use, and the government did use, the Sedition Act. They closed down newspapers that criticized the administration and criticized the Federalist Party, criticized Congress. They fine people. They throw people in jail for a couple years. So the Sedition Act is used throughout the United States to destroy dissent, to attack the people who disagree with what the government's doing. And this is the Federalist Party's real attempt to force the American population to support their policies, especially if they go to war against France. So the Federalist Party is immediately criticized for doing this stuff. This is gross, unconstitutional. This is destroying all the civil rights of the people, basically. And the people know it. I mean, the people are fairly literate. They can read the Constitution. They understand that this is a destruction of like the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. I mean, on down the line. This is really bad stuff. So the Federalist Party is becoming very unpopular. And as it appears that the U.S. is not going to go to war, and that kind of fever pitch for war just kind of fades down toward the end of 1798. But now you have these laws on the books. So the need for the laws seems to dissipate fairly quickly. And people start getting afraid more of the U.S. government than of going to war against France. They say, look, we have these 3 new laws that makes the government very powerful in getting rid of almost anybody who complains. And we also have the possibility of a 50,000-man army roaming around in the U.S., even though there's no war to fight. So the American people are very leery of this stuff, especially when mostly the Sedition Act is being enforced against people who complain. And obviously it's the Republican Party that is attacked. Newspapers that were kind of slanted toward the Republican Party and criticizing the Federalists, they're closed down. Their editors and their owners are thrown in jail and fined. So the Federalists are in power, and they're usually using the Sedition Act to crack down on Republican kind of publicity attempts. Jefferson and Madison, the leaders of the Republican Party, are absolutely livid that this stuff has happened. So they write up 2 declarations that this stuff is unconstitutional and should not be enforced. They send these declarations to 2 different states. Jefferson sends his to the state legislature of Virginia. Madison sends his to the state legislature of Kentucky. And overall, they complain about the unconstitutional growth of power that the Federalists have been building up for themselves by passing these laws. And they basically argue that individual states should have the power to void, nullify, or refuse to follow national laws when those national laws break the Constitution. And this starts off a whole theory that becomes known as the states' rights argument, which is basically that the states are all equal adherents to the Constitution. The Constitution, the federal government is formed by a coming together of the states. And the states should have the power to resist certain national laws, especially when those national laws break the Constitution. And the states' rights theory will grow and grow and grow. But because Republicans didn't have majorities in Congress, they didn't have the presidency, they went to the state legislatures because that's where they could still get majorities to pass these resolutions. So Virginia and Kentucky both passed these statements. They kind of give official state recognition that this is kind of the official state theory. So the Republicans are now rising up as kind of the defenders of liberty and freedom in the United States, and portray themselves in that way. Going into 1799, Adams announces that the American people have risen up. They've shown their resolution. They've shown their national strength to the French, that they're not going to back down against French threats or anything. And he says in 1799, now the French are willing to negotiate. The French don't want to go to war against the United States. They're at war with basically the rest of Europe, and it's going badly for France. So the French leaders ask for a new negotiation, and Adams goes to Congress and says, I'm going to send some more ambassadors to avoid war with France. So negotiations go through basically the rest of 1799, and he eventually gets a treaty, a deal, in the year 1800. This becomes known as the Convention of 1800. This is a peace treaty between France and the United States. Adams loves it. Adams supports it. But this creates a problem for his Federalist Party. A lot of the Federalists were warmongers against France. They had passed these laws, they passed the funding, they passed the larger army. They wanted war against France. And they go to President Adams in 1800 and say, don't sign this treaty, don't send it to the Senate. Because if you do, you will destroy your own party. You will split your party between pro-war faction and anti-war faction. Right? Does that make sense? Because people in Congress are now on record for supporting movement against France. And now you're going to send them a peace treaty. How are they going to justify that going into this year of elections? And more importantly, they tell him, if the United States goes to war against France in the year 1800, the Republican Party has been avowedly pro-France for over 10 years. We can destroy the Republican Party in this election. Because if the Republicans are pro-French and the United States is at war against France, then the Federalists can accuse the Republicans of being unpatriotic. Does that make sense? And the American population does not usually vote for people that they believe are unpatriotic. So they go to Adams and say, start a war with France. Don't sign a peace treaty. We need a war in order to win these elections. And Adams says no. Adams says it is immoral to send American soldiers and sailors to Europe or wherever they're going to go fight. They're going to go die so that we can win an election. That doesn't make any sense to him. And he takes a hard stance. He takes a moral stance. He says, war with France would probably win me re-election to President of the United States because, we could attack Jefferson all day long for being pro-French, for being a sellout to France. But he says, I will not do it because I'm not willing to live with my conscience that I willingly sent people to their death just so I could win an election. And he takes a principled stand. And the Federalists, especially Hamilton, are livid. The pro-war people, they can't figure it out. So Adams does split his party in the election of 1800 between pro-war and anti-war factions. The Republican Party is very united going into these elections because they have stood up almost to a man and rejected the Alien Sedition Acts, supported the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and they're largely let off the hook for being pro-French because the United States does not go to war. Does that make sense? And in doing that, in the election of 1800, Adams is knocked out of office and almost all the Federalists are knocked out of Congress. In this election, Jefferson wins. And the Republican Party sweeps into power. So Adams' refusal to go to war did exactly as he was warned it would. It destroyed his own re-election attempt, and it largely hurt the Federalists in a big way throughout the congressional elections throughout the country. And this basically elects Thomas Jefferson to the presidency and puts his party in power. So when Jefferson is inaugurated and becomes president in 1801, in March 1801, he will have Congress behind him and he will have a lot of power to bring his vision of what the United States should be into reality. So, questions about any of that stuff? None at all. But Jefferson will also inherit the massive problems that this has created, especially foreign policy-wise between Britain and France. Yeah.
Was Adams shunned out of the government after this?
Yeah, Adams goes off in retirement. He's done. He's a fairly old guy by this point. I mean, let's see, 90 by the time. So yeah, he's in his about mid-60s by this point. So yeah, he's retired. He was involved in the revolution from 1770. So he's 30 years in politics. He bows out. He goes away. Goes back home. And Washington actually died in 1799, so he had like 2 years retirement. So Washington's out, and Jefferson is the new national leader, and he and the Republican Party are the next generation of leaders, and they will be dominant in the United States through to 1816. So they're going to have a long time to implement their vision of the future.